once again, everybody, we have finally reached the end of our Elements of Historical Theory lecture series, Part 4. Let's get right at it. So the first one I want to talk about in this particular lecture is what is known as fringe theory. This idea basically posits that the further away from the center of power a person or group lives, the more difficult it is for them to be controlled or swayed by the authority represented by that center of power. So think about it this way. You have that center of power right here in the middle of a map, per se. As people move away from that center of power, the more difficult it is for that center of power to control what is going on the fringes, on the edges of that society. And in addition to that, the more corruption slips through the cracks along those edges as that center of power is losing its ability to exert its authority on those fringes. So in a lot of ways, on the fringe can be expressed as being more lawless than the areas closer to the center of that power, but also in a sort of a Hegelian dialectic sort of way, it also represents possibly and arguably more freedom along those fringes as well, which is usually the main reason that people move away from that center of power, because perhaps they are feeling oppressed in some way by the authority represented by that center of power, so they desire to escape that by moving further and further away from those fringes, or from that center, I should say, to the fringes. Next is something called frontier theory. Now this is closely tied in with that idea of fringe theory as well. And this idea posits that as long as there is a frontier, social tensions can be released by the ability of discontented persons to move into a frontier and away from that center of power and or areas they are not welcomed or feel happy. Something that's known as the safety valve, if you will. Something that was first posited in American history in the mid-19th century as settlers from the eastern parts of the country were moving into those opening western areas. And this is something that, of course, we will discuss a little bit in the course of our class, but really is a feature of the later 19th century to a larger degree, or that is typically thought of when you think of like the Old West and things like that. So that would generally be covered in American history too, at the beginnings of that course. But there are certainly elements of it that fall within the time frame that we will be discussing as well. Now, this idea of the frontier, or the safety valve of the frontier, prevents revolt or rebellion in those core settled areas, which is why it's considered that safety valve, if you will. Those discontented peoples have some place they can go to avoid coming in conflict with that center of authority or that which they are discontented with in that original area. Now, as the frontier advances or fills up, civilization advances as well. But when that frontier is full, which means no more frontier, that safety valve stops working. And the potential for conflict is vastly increased. And we see this too in American history as well. Next we have zero-sum economics. And this theory basically states that there is only so much wealth available in the world. Now modern economics essentially, without getting into too much details, posits that wealth can be generated essentially out of nothing and spread out, or distributed however those in power or however the economic machine operates. Well, in most historical times, this was not the case. Wealth was considered finite. Wealth was tied to material things like gold and silver and commercial goods, and most of all, land. Land was considered the source of all wealth. Whoever holds the most amount of land, and of course the resources that can be extracted from that land, holds the most power and can dominate the world. As land becomes more scarce, more conflict arises. And this is something we'll see too manifest itself in the course of the periods that we will be examining. Last but certainly not least, it's a short and sweet one, something that's pretty easier, or much easier, I should say, to understand than some of these others that we've discussed. It's the law of unintended consequences. Consequences of any and every decision cannot always be predicted, accounted, and or prepared for. Now, we kind of covered this in a sense when in our discussion of some of the other theories, but it's also a specific kind of law unto itself, and it illustrates the unpredictable nature of choice. And I really like this cartoon here that really illustrates this idea in practice, or this idea manifesting itself in something that we all can understand, that is more a modern feature or current event, if you will. And it's a gun shop. And there's the gun store owner, and here's all the people protesting, down with guns, they want more gun control. And you see here, the sales of that gun shop are going up. Now, the unintended consequence here, of course, is that those that are advocating for more gun control are actually driving these gun sales up, because you have a whole host of other people who are afraid that they might actually win the argument and get legislation passed that will restrict guns. So, in reaction to that, they're stockpiling weapons. So, by trying to restrict guns, they're actually having the opposite effect and driving those gun sales ever higher. And of course, you have the owner of the gun shop says, do us all a favor and pass more gun laws, because that's only going to increase his business even more. The law of unintended consequences in perfect effect. Well, that concludes the fourth and final installment of our Elements of Historical Theory lecture series. Please study these very closely. We will be using these throughout the course of this semester to help you better understand and analyze historical events and processes. These are very, very important. Until next time, study hard, and I'll see you soon.